To be here with you all today, along with our co-moderator, Frederick, who has also been with us since the beginning of our book club. So, a couple of notes for you all of housekeeping before we start. Feel free to use your chat box on the right and let us know where you're from and maybe a word of how you're feeling in this moment. Our TRF team is tuning in with you there, so we'll be sharing your comments after each discussion question. So please do engage with one another, do engage with us. We are there with you. And a quick note, if you find that you're unable to comment, just be sure that you are subscribed to the TRF YouTube channel in order to do so. And as you settle in, feel free to grab some water, grab a cup of tea. I'll tell you a little bit about TRF, and we will outline a little of what you can expect from today's event. So we are a 501c3 nonprofit dedicated to supporting and growing a community of clinicians, researchers, educators, and people whose lives are affected by trauma. And in this season, we are going to be featuring a book called The Politics of Trauma, Somatics, Healing, and Social Justice by Staci Haines. And Staci will be joining us on the very last episode on December 1st for a live hour-and-a-half Q&A session. So we hope that you join us for the next 3 weeks, where we bring together as many as 15 panelists from the community, just like you, to have a discussion to then wrap up on December 1st with Staci. And a little note about our panelists: we'll be sure to be dropping their bios into the YouTube chat, so when they are speaking, you'll have a chance to get to know each of them. And we do really welcome a diverse array of voices, of different experiences and thoughts and backgrounds. There's no criteria other than reading the part of the book that we're going to be discussing this week. So if you have any interest in participating as a panelist, please be sure to apply. You can find that link on our website. And to help us in this conversation as well, we're always happy to offer a study guide as a companion to your reading. I think that will also be available on our website as well. And before introducing Frederick, where he can also go through some of wellness recommendations and guidelines for today's show, I just want to introduce you all to the TRF team that makes this entire production possible. We have Pat and Connor, who's our media team. We have Stephanie, Emma, Liz, and Star, who are all program specialists. And shout outs to Mary and Abby, who are also program and customer support specialists as well. There's just a lot of work that goes on behind the scenes, so just take that moment to acknowledge all the time, attention, and care that brings this together. And I'd like to introduce now our co-book club moderator, Frederick Mann. He, for over 20 years, has worked with diverse populations and professions directly and indirectly as a teacher, administrator, consultant, and researcher. Frederick has worked as a clinical referral coordinator and trainer at the Child Trauma Training Center in the Department of Psychiatry at UMass Chan Medical School, where he's provided assistance and referral support for families, clinicians, educators, and other professionals throughout the state of Massachusetts. He's also trained and facilitated workshops in how to understand trauma, identify trauma triggers and responses, and support and aid children who have experienced trauma. So thank you so much for being here, Frederick, and helping us in this conversation. It would be lovely if you would like to share with us some of the wellness recommendations and guidelines. And I will go ahead and share some screens for our folks to follow along. Here we go.
Some of the topics are difficult. Please, please, please take care of yourself. Here's some options. Take a pause, get a drink of water, stretch, deep breathing, name the 5 senses. Whatever you need to do to reset and allow yourself to be in a calm and peaceful place. So we would like you to be gracious with the differing opinions, please take space and leave space for others. Panelists, please keep share to about 2 minutes and please stay on topic for today.
Great. And this is just a quick schedule, so you all know we'll be coming together at this time every single week from now until our last session with Staci on December 1st. And here we go. This is what you'll see also in the study guide. We just grabbed a couple of sessions. We'll be reviewing the first two parts in 2 days book club. Frederick, would you like to go through some of our salient points for part one?
Yeah, so part one, somatics is when we are at our most whole self, where actions align with values we want. Trauma and oppression disconnects us from ourselves and others. Somatic awareness helps the unconscious, disconnected actions and reactions become conscious, which gives us more choices in creating pathways that do align our actions with our values. Exploring the social systems that are contributing to our experience is also essential to somatic transformation. Deconstruction and then the rebuilding ourselves collectively as a group and individually is essential to reach embodiment. So this is going to be quite an amazing conversation today. As you have been reading the text, it's pretty dense. However, we hope that through our conversations, we are able to massage the content and make it real, not only to us, but to the audience beyond through digesting and interpreting the content from the various perspectives. Pretty dense. However,
it looks like we have a little bit of an echo. One moment. If we can have someone mute.
Seems like it may have been you, Teresa.
Sorry about that. That was me. My YouTube was going on in the background. Okay, well, we ready to start off with question number 1. Let me pull that up again. There we go. Okay. Question number 1, I'll go ahead and kick it off. Why is feeling sensations important? Why is feeling sensations important? So our panelists, if you have something to share, go ahead and raise your hand so we know. Eva, why is feeling sensations important?
Yeah, I mean, I think that's such a beautiful foundational question, because for me, that's like the basis of what helps me to feel alive. It's a way to, I feel like in a world, we get so disconnected from our whole self. It can be so intellectual. And actually, when I allow myself to feel sensory grounded sensations, the information that is alive every moment in my body, like right now as I speak, I notice a little tightening in my throat, and that's probably because I'm nervous. I just launched right in to speak, and it's the first time I'm a panelist, and my body's going like, "Ooh, this is exciting." And just when I allow it, like just by naming it, feels very freeing and liberating, rather than going, "I'm here, I'm all professional and serious." I just really, it makes life richer, I think.
Yeah, thank you. Some sense of your sensations bringing you to truly experience your fullness of the present moment.
Absolutely.
Great. Nicole, love to hear from you.
I agree with Eva, and I apologize. My voice is like halfway gone today, but I feel that sensations, if we tune into them rather than sort of tune them out, they can provide us with a lot of information about who we really are, what we're comfortable with, what our real values are. And I think it can help us if we're willing to listen to ourselves and go with that and follow what we're sensing, I think it can help us come to a truth that I think helps us, as Staci Haines says, like sort of align our practices and our actions with our values, our true values.
Yeah. So a way to allow the body to lead us into what our truth is. Thank you, Nicole. Let's see, Christine. You just got to unmute yourself, Christine.
Sorry about that.
Go.
Yeah, I agree with that. It's a great foundational question, and my answer kind of does correlate with Nicole's in that it's from coming from decades of hypervigilance and constantly scanning the environment with that connection with the sensations in the body. And as I'm learning from the book, soma being even beyond the body, and holistically encompassing other areas, it gives me more groundedness and communication with my surroundings. So it's eased the hypervigilance. It's been really contributing factor to bringing it down. So it's necessary for me to connect with my environment, because the feeling sensations are more, it's more intense, but it's more of a messaging system to me, where I don't need to rely on that constant scanning of the environment.
Yeah, it's interesting you bring that up, and I think this will come up in our next questions, but what happens when we experience trauma that then make it so that the sensations in our body, even though usually they are there to help us be present, can then turn into something that actually takes us out of being able to be present, and something that is difficult to tune into. So yeah, thank you for bring that aspect. Karen, let's hear from you.
Hi, thank you. I think the sensations in our body is really foundational for trauma recovery. You know, we, as CBT therapists, well, I should say I'm a CBT therapist, and we learned how connected thoughts are connected to emotions, are connected to behaviors. But I also teach my clients the connection with physical sensations in our bodies, because if you don't know how you're feeling, if you're numb, your body will give you telltale signs. So I use the body a lot as, if you don't know how you're feeling, what is your body doing? Is your heart racing? Is your palms, are they sweating? You know, is it hard to breathe? Do you have shortness of breath? So I use the body as a guide sometimes, and teaching clients how to tap into that, because the better you understand the way you think, the way you feel, the way your body is responding, all that is very useful information that you can then use on your healing path. Thank you.
Thank you, Karen. And for those of you who, I wonder if how many of us here have read the book, The Body Keeps a Score. And if that is a place that a lot of you found your way to us, and if not, it is the book that the president of the Trauma Research Foundation, Bessel van der Kolk, wrote. But I feel like is of course a leading text that has really opened up the world's mind to understanding exactly how is the body communicating to us from all of our past experiences, and how then, if it's communicating to us in that way, how can we also go back to the body and listen to the body and have the body be our avenue towards healing. If you haven't read the book, I'd highly recommend it. Nadia.
Hi. I found that one of the most interesting parts of these first two chapters was when Ms. Haines listed, and she kept listing, more and more benefits of feeling the sensations, and that ultimately it was like finding a balance between the extremes, you know, boundaries and then bonding. creativity, and then numbness, expressing anger healthfully versus, the fight, flight, freeze. And so feeling the sensations as a trauma survivor and helping others do that now, the more that they're in a safe place where they can feel everything and maybe even, go over a prior memory of trauma through EMDR or whatever it might be, the more I've seen them entering bliss or able to allow themselves, be in that like childlike kind of present moment, and the disassociation is going away. So I just think it's key to living balanced emotionally, mentally, spiritually, as an infinite form in this finite body, that feeling it all, we're in bodies. So that's really the main message that I got from her about feeling sensations. It was beautiful.
Yeah, and I love how you also highlighted this nuance of it can both be a place of being bound and also place of freedom.
Right.
And it's so interesting, of course, with Staci and what she practices, but how can the body go from a place where maybe we feel victim to or suffering from what we're feeling or running away from, disassociating from, to how can we be liberated, and how can we use body and somatic work as a place of liberation? And that nuance, and I think getting from that one place to the other is such a complex and difficult, and can be a difficult path if those emotions are the ones that, of course, are stored and experienced when that trauma happened. And what's so amazing about this book is that it really creates a path that there's a possibility to be free from that. Yeah. Thank you, Nadia. Well, let's go ahead and tune in quickly to our virtual audience before moving on to the next question. Let's see, we have Aman letting us know trauma blocks sensation and leaves us with fight, flight, and freeze. And Holly sharing with us saying, sensations lead me to explore what stories I allow to shape my worldview and behaviors. Beautiful. Yeah. Thank you so much for those shares. And let's move on to the next question. Let me go ahead and pull that up. Okay, Frederick.
I don't see the question yet. Oh, okay, perfect. How does our baseline for safety get mixed up when trauma is experienced? Let me read it again. How does our baseline for safety get mixed up when trauma is experienced? All right, Renata.
No, yeah. So I'm a therapist, and I've been working with little kids a lot on this too, because if we don't have the safety, the attachment, if we don't feel like we're seen or we're heard, starting at little ages up, even in the trauma areas, we're taught that our body is not what we can listen to. We're taught that who we have in our lives aren't people that we could necessarily trust. And so that's when we see the disassociation, the fight, flight, or freeze. That's where we see all of these come in and disrupt the baseline, to where our baseline, once trauma happens, is not a normal person's baseline that's not experienced that trauma and it's not had that. The trauma baseline changes our safe baseline.
Wow, that's pretty insightful. Just the notion of how our sense of safety and it's our sense of understanding is disrupted, and what we are striving is safety versus other dimensions. I appreciate that. That's really nice. Eva, thank you.
Yeah, I really resonate with what you're saying, Renata, as well. And just to add to that, just we are relational beings. We have a need to belong. And if the people that I depend on for my survival act in ways that don't make me feel safe, but yet I depend for them, this is especially true for children, of course, then I'm going to have to adapt to survive. And if that goes on for a sustained period of time, the kind of, say, the hypervigilance that I have to adapt to be safe, to preempt, to be able to adjust and cope in the environment is going to become, I'm going to get used to that. And so if I'm used to a certain level of high alertness, say, that can actually become my baseline over time. And so then even when I'm grown up and maybe have found safer environments where the same thing isn't happening anymore, I might not feel able to enjoy the kind of calm or nervous system response, or my window of tolerance. I might actually feel more at ease with a less safe, objectively less safe environment, because that's what I'm used to. I think in the book, there's a great example of Vietnam War veterans being shown footage of war scenes and measuring their physiological responses. And to the researchers' surprise, there was actually a sense of relaxation that happened when this footage was seen, as opposed to fear response, because it was kind of familiar. And I think that's the danger, that it takes a lot of kind of unraveling and tracking and relearning, and that I can be safe, that's a process to establish a baseline again.
Well, I think that's so fascinating. And I never thought through this as well as you just explained, and how unusual circumstances can become normalized, and we can be conditioned for the, I don't want to use it abnormal, but for the experience that might not be as the best for us, and how that becomes, it's normalized to the point that is invisible, that is, it should be disturbing. I love that insight that you just shared. Nicole, thank you. Thank you.
I think that trauma often involves a betrayal or a basic shattering of assumptions that what you expected in the world or of yourself is not what you've trusted was going to happen or would be okay. And so I think it can really disrupt, really disorganize a person's sense of safety to experience trauma. And so I think that a lot of the times, myself included, I think a lot of survivors of trauma will experience fear in a sense, and like a foreboding that something bad is happening in what other people would perceive to be safe environments or relationships. And I can describe it like I've been married for over 15 years, and I still, sometimes like ask myself, is my partner trustworthy, despite the countless times that person has been trustworthy. But I think as the book described too, sometimes it ends up showing up as sort of looking for the worst to happen in any scenario.
Yes, I actually want to say I really appreciate the description of the shattering and the disruption and the disorganization of oneself, because it, like, if someone was whole, there's a containedness and a secure connectedness, and then when trauma impacts, it shatters and it creates, as you just described, this not only disorientation, but these broken dimensions, and that creates other ramifications. So I really appreciate how you describe that, and you can understand why safety then becomes the attraction for someone. Danny, thank you so much. Danny, you will end us on this question. Thank you so much.
Yeah, thank you. So something I really appreciated about the book as a whole, though I'll try to focus it on this question in particular, was the emphasis on the broader social analysis that accompanies, even maybe traumas that occur within a one-to-one relationship. And so to try to use a relatively benign example, I was thinking about like the topic of bullying. And it's not so much just the trauma that one experiences as a result of being bullied by an individual. It's in addition to the act of being bullied, being traumatic, that layered on top of that is, say, for example, other friends who didn't take it seriously, didn't come to one's defense, maybe a teacher who didn't intervene, decided to overlook what had happened, whatever else. And it's that layering of all of these different factors that occur within communities that needs to be looked at, as opposed to just, again, what happens in a one-to-one exchange between people. And so that was very very striking to me, and it's just really a rich topic to dig into generally, and just what a sense of not just being unsafe with this person, but being unsafe within a whole community can do to somebody's like baseline level of safety.
I really appreciate that analysis, because I mean, for people who have began to read about the literature around sexual assault and how not only the person is assaulted by the person, but then the system in terms of the reporting and how the person who's assaulted has to navigate that. And then the larger, like, it becomes this oppressive, what I call compounding. It becomes a compounding impact of trauma, because there's layers and layers of challenges. And it's always amazing when a person or a group has been able to fight through these compounding barriers, these layers of barriers, in order to receive justice or receive some kind of acknowledgement and accountability. So we are going to transition to the next question, but this is a great discussion. And I appreciate this conversation, because this book is so dense. And so we need a lot of people to kind of comb through it and just break it apart in order for us all to find many of the rich nuggets.
Very true. A couple of comments from online audience. Veronica Taylor shared, the baseline for safety is lowered, so we are easily triggered, always on guard and attuned to danger when the danger is not there. And Dr. Abby Hasbury says, I refer to that distorted baseline as familiar, but not comfortable with my clients. Yeah, that is, that definitely rings familiar in that sense, where what happens when your baseline is no longer safety, but is actually what you've become used to. Let's just say if you grew up in a household that was not safe, and then realizing that for some people, when they do then experience safety, that can actually feel threatening to them because it's so different than what their baseline was. I remember that being a big aha moment for me in reading this book, is realizing if someone has become used to a more dysregulated system, because that became their foundation, that going into a state of regulation, there can be a period of orienting to that can actually be even more dysregulating to them. So thank you, Dr. Abby, for bringing that in. Okay, well, on to our next question. Thank you all to the panelists for all your thoughts and reflections, and also to the virtual audience. Our third question is, how is the ability to be vulnerable essential to meeting our safety needs? So how is the ability to be vulnerable essential to meeting our safety needs? That feels very vulnerable to ask and to talk about. Susan, thank you for sharing.
I wanted to kind of go, I was about to put my hand up on the last topic, but I think this is a nice seg. On page 136 of the hard copy, I found it so helpful when Staci Haines draws our attention to the fact that safety is not only about material safety. And she writes, safety gets created when your agency, your interdependence, and your autonomy are affirmed. Emotional and relational safety is created when people acknowledge and support your emotional life, your empathy, and your capacity to act on your own behalf, as well as on behalf of others. And when that's compromised, I think there's sort of a risk not necessarily involved to get back to some sort of threshold of safety. And but that's the place of growth. If that risk can be taken in a place of trust and can be affirmed, then the vulnerability kind of gives you a space of growth or of recalibrating what the baseline might be, I think.
Thank you so much for reading that part out. Can you share again the 3 factors she says is agency, interdependency, and what was the other?
And autonomy.
And autonomy. Beautiful. Yeah, I love what you. And you said something that just made me think about TRF actually just hosted our first play-based healing summit this last week. And a big lesson in there that we were finding is if you are safe to play, you are safe to learn. And how being able to feel safe to play, that play can become the container where you refine the ability to experiment and find that sense of self. And that oftentimes there are people who have experienced trauma who the ability to play isn't there anymore. And that can actually be a really good marker of what's going on in someone's system, and that actually inviting someone into play can even bring up difficult emotions like shame and guilt and fear. So I like what you just shared there about being able to find I forget what your words were, but finding your agency.
It was Staci Haines' words, not mine. But not just material safety, not just like shelter, et cetera, but all of these other modes. And I think if I could just expand slightly, one thing that I found so helpful about this book is when she talks about how we often in order to sustain safety, we often compromise belonging and dignity. And so that just brings into the mix, and I'll shut up because I see other people's hands are up, but this kind of risk that has to be taken to undo those habits to get back to a place where we can restore dignity or forge really meaningful and sustained belonging.
Yeah, beautiful. Yeah, I like how she brings those three things are very important to her: belonging, dignity, and safety. Thank you, Susan. Eva.
Just think the ability to play also, that's a nice segue to this question, because I can only, they kind of go hand in hand. If I can't feel vulnerable, I probably also can't play in an authentic way. If I just stay with my own lived embodied experience, I spend a lot of my childhood in a kind of frozen state / appeasement response. And so the play was more kind of escape into fantasy, but I wasn't very capable of a relational play. That only came much later when I learned to land in my body and to kind of establish a more grounded experience of aliveness. And it's this dilemma where to be safe, I need relationship, but if I don't feel safe to be vulnerable, I can't have the relationship. And that's of course, it needs certain conditions around me in my environment to be able to be vulnerable. There needs to be some actual safety around. And yeah, I think the context is really important. I guess what I'm trying to say is what I like about what's very clear in Staci Haines' book is that all these circles, the spheres of influence need to be taken into account. And it takes the kind of blame or the sense of it's my fault that I didn't do that, it's my fault. It takes that away. It places kind of the responsibility firmly into the wider context. And that's so important. Sorry, that's maybe I'm diverging from the question a bit. I think that's your point about being dense. There's so many strands to follow. I'll stop and see if somebody else can speak more linearly.
No, that's beautiful. And I think you point to all of these things are not linear. they're so multifaceted. And, you know, where does vulnerability lead to safety? Where does safety, you know, intersect with belonging? And then what are these things that you need to then make sure you have dignity? And can you have, you know, one without the other two? And, you know, these, spheres of influence, I think you put that in such a good way. And it's so important for us to acknowledge, like Susan spoke to before, you know, that it's not even just physical. We have to also be thinking about the emotional and energetic experiences as well, and spiritual. So thank you, Eva. Nicole.
So I think that being vulnerable is a little bit of a privileged thing to do, because being vulnerable to me means being willing to experience pain and hurt. And if you're a child, for instance, who's experiencing abuse or some other form of trauma, being vulnerable doesn't necessarily, in my opinion, make you safer unless you're in like a safe place already. But I think that in the long run, I think, you know, if you're actually out of a very oppressive situation where you have some influence, some control over your life, and you're able to, and you have some safety, I think being vulnerable, honestly, in my mind, seems like maybe one of the only ways to actually ultimately figure out and experience the pain and realize the harm that was done to you, and sort of process the trauma. I think the somatic paradigm is really helpful, because it's about like tuning into all the sensations that you have and sort of reviewing what trauma did to you and being open to that pain. And I think and ultimately, if you are open to it and go through a process of healing, and realize and find a way to align your values with your practices and those types of things, I think you can bring yourself to a place of greater safety. And not only that, you could probably bring others along with you and maybe elevate the conditions and the sort of the justice that people are able to experience around you, and hopefully diminish the oppression that hurt you and others. But it's a long process. And so I guess it's a complicated, I think this is the hardest question.
Thank you, Nicole. Yeah, you know, and I think what you shared also brings us back to our first question about sensations. It's like, you know, the vulnerability opening up to bring our awareness to what we're feeling in our body, which in that moment of trauma, which is when we weren't able to, you know, process it entirely so that it's still in our sensations. And that to open up to those sensations feels very vulnerable, again, because we're revisiting something that we experienced priorly that was too much. And then how can we expand that, you know, that term that they use, that window of tolerance, for us to be present with ourselves and heal and soothe and be there for ourselves in a way that we didn't receive, you know, when that trauma was happening. And so it is a vulnerable thing to ask people to, you know, it's not going back in time, but it's revisiting with the body what it was experiencing then. And that of course is then tied intricately to us building senses of safety in the present moment. So yeah. Thank you so much. We're going to tune in with our virtual audience, and then I know Danny and Nadia, you had your hands up, but hopefully you'll be able to share with us for the next question. So Thomas Hicken said, like we are saying that people who have experienced trauma have lost trust in people and or society. On the other hand, experiencing vulnerability in a safe environment allows for healing. Thank you, Thomas. And Holly shared, to be fully alive and connected to ourselves requires the vulnerability of allowing inevitable pain and joy and everything in between. Yeah, thank you so much, Holly. Okay, we'll go on to our next question.
How has the objectification of the body disconnected us from each other? How has the objectification of the body disconnected us from each other? Wow, that is a question there. Wow, I am curious of how we massage this concept. Okay. All right, Danny, please share with us.
So something I was thinking about with this one was if I'm understanding the definition of the soma in the first place, it seemed like there are a lot of ways that that could be defined. And yet something that I took away from thinking about that was the body in its relational context. And I was just thinking about how limited our relationships to our bodies are by the narratives that dominant culture dictate how we ought to relate to our bodies. And so that's just like a really, it's an exciting thought experiment to imagine how we could be in a more frequent state of pleasure within our bodies, separate from whatever the dominant cultural narratives dictate. The conditions would be that would allow for that in the first place. I hope I'm not losing the point or being too tangential here. But I just think about how inhibited we are about experiencing pleasure, and how much that disengages us from one another. And it's very exciting to think about a greater range of interpretations of our body experiences, body shapes, so on and so forth, being acceptable, and what that could do for our capacity to connect with one another.
Yeah, I appreciate what you just shared. And as you shared that, it made me think of the danger of a single story from dominant culture around what body is attractive, what can you do with your body, what your body represents, as trying to connect with what you're saying, that there's this limited narrative about the body, whereas the narrative needs to be open and multifaceted. And from what I understand, like the limiting dimensions of how the body is objectified. I'm hoping I tuned into what you were saying on that.
I appreciate the way you reflected that back. That was helpful, I think, in shoring up what I was trying to say.
Yeah.
So that was a team effort there. Thank you.
Okay, no problem. So I'm going around. Renata, please jump in.
So I kind of think of this in a couple of ways about the objectification and going back to the last question and this question, it kind of ties, because if we look at people that have been sexually abused, that kind of thing, they lose that connection with their body. And where we've talked about kind of being hypervigilant and being away and being kind of like turtles in our shells, then what has happened, there's some that are so disassociated from their body that they just go and seek out risky behaviors and risky living because they're not in tune with their body. And then I'm thinking about the objectification of our body itself. And like, as a society, like, I am Caucasian and I am chubby, plus size, whatever you want to say. So I wouldn't fit the norm of what a traditional beauty standard would be. So that's automatically been ingrained to my system, to where I feel a certain level of distrust when I walk into certain situations. And I know that because I feel like the gym. Let's just be honest. When I go to the gym and I see all the people there that's skinny, and I'm just like, they've got to be thinking, like, if you would have been at the gym, instead of eating your Dunkin' Donuts or whatever, you would look like that too. And so on a broader level, I think that those things that have been ingrained, that the objectifications in that way completely kind of disassociate ourselves from each other, because I can't trust you not to be judging me because of the stories that I've been told and that I've begun to embody.
I appreciate what you just shared around how our larger cultural narratives or the media, what various means it impacts our interpersonal um, relations around our bodies, but also our internal understanding. But it creates this disconnect in terms of how we view, how we feel, how others feel about this miracle, but yet it's placed in these very limiting categories. I really appreciate that, and that's so helpful. I think once you go through a serious illness, sometimes you become more in tune and appreciative. A person can the fascinating dimensions of one body and the beauty of it. I from my experience. But let's bring in some more voices. Christine, thank you so much.
Hi, yeah, I wanted to point out that I really appreciated the author bringing in at an institutional level of the separation between mind and body, and that separateness in ourselves, that creates a disconnect in ourselves, but also that separateness, like you're saying, Frederick, also in the media, in religion, shaming the body, sins of the flesh, creating that disconnect, that separateness. That's what opens the window for judgment on others. And like the last speaker was saying too, that whether it's happening or not, it's a perceived judgment going on just because of the stories that are at those levels, institutional levels, societal levels, religious levels. So that separateness is just a breeding ground for disconnection in ourselves and then with each other.
That's fascinating. And it's always curious of what value having the body separated and injected. What is the larger value of that? But that's not the question we're going to answer. But I want to make sure. But it has there's something significant around it. I'm going to just squeeze in one more person, Nadia, if that's okay. And we're going to squeeze you in before we jump to the next question. But this is very fascinating. Man, I'm so glad I'm in this book club, because I was reading this. I was like, oh my goodness, how do you break this down into different levels? So it's nice to have some people to talk about it. So thank you.
Yeah, thank you. This question is like embodies all the work that I do around helping people with shame. And the whole focus of life in the modern world, objectifying body, keeps, and particularly trauma victims, focused on the illusion that we are just finite physical bodies and we are just our minds. And what Miss Haines kept talking about was that there's these identities and there's these roles and there's, we go about our days, but there's always this thing that everybody is searching for that's missing. There's always, whatever the next spouse, the next job, there's an unanswered question. And so everywhere we see a focus on a body keeps us stuck in a belief that we are just bodies and our thoughts. And what I learned in my own trauma work is to remind myself, my mantra every day is, I'm not a body nor the thoughts my mind makes, and that our minds send attack thoughts to separate us from each other, like this question asked, and from that the only truth is that we're infinite beings, whole, perfect, and complete. And that nothing that no one has said or done, including ourselves, changes that. And so when we're aware we're not our thoughts, I can say, okay, I am in fear and judgment and attacking somebody else, disconnecting, like the question asked, or I am in shame and I'm disconnected from myself. So all the signs and everything about objectifying a body is like arrows shot at us constantly throughout the day that are very harmful to living, a spiritually and community connected life, because we have to remember we're not bodies nor our thoughts. So.
Wow, thank you. That was a I need you to type that in the chat. I love that mantra. I want to write it down. Thank you.
I'll send you some other things.
Yeah, thank
Thank
you so
you.
much. I really appreciate that. We're not our body, our thoughts, and all that. Wow, that is a great way to transition to the next question. Thank you. Back to you, Teresa.
Well, wonderfully, some comments from our online audience are right on as well. So I think we're all sharing some similar thoughts. But Veronica Taylor said, when through objectification of the body, we are disconnected from the self, and it is difficult to connect to others. How can I connect to others when I'm disconnected from myself? And then Aman shared, I think humans forgot that we are souls in human form and we are all interconnected. The Buddhism concept of interbeing need to remain in our collective conscious. So yeah, a lot of similar things reflected here. Well, great. Let's move on to our next question. What are some examples of embodied survival strategies you see in your life or others? So again, what are some examples of embodied survival strategies that you see in your life or others? So I know this might call upon some vulnerability. So I thank you all for staying present with us. And of course, those of you who are following up with us virtually, also staying present with your body, with your sensations. And if you also want to answer that in your own way, please do share with us. Let's start with Karen.
To me, this question is very powerful, because all we ever try to do is survive, right? Some of us are just trying to get to the next day, especially directly after trauma. The ways I personally have embodied survival strategies that I'm not always consciously aware of is my body will tighten up throughout the day. And I'm not even tracking like what stressful thing happened where my body will start to clench. So I know I personally use that one. In my clients, what I often see, there's this thing of, I'm trying to think exactly how it goes, but it's basically to get along, to be along. In other words, not speaking your truth, not advocating for yourself, because the conflict, they don't know where it's going to go. And it can lead to an area of not feeling safe, an area where they may feel too vulnerable and maybe not trusting themselves enough, let alone the other person. So there's tons of ways that survival and trying to just get through the day can show up in our clients. All the fight, flight, freeze, dissociate, all of those pop up through the day. And I think an essential piece of our work is showing people how to be more aware of that. That's when the healing can happen as well. So thank you.
Thank you, Karen. Yeah, paying attention to those little things, not little, they're big, but those sensations that we may even have become misattuned to, or so blended with that we don't realize the small tensions or the ways that we might hold our jaw or posture or legs or standing. So yeah. Eva.
Yeah, I also
We'll
feel
go to
it's
Naima. Sorry.
very powerful question, and I feel called to be vulnerable and share that for me, gender is an embodied survival response. I grew up in a small, rural, conservative Christian village in Germany, and there were only two genders. There was only heterosexuality, there was only whiteness. And the way that was communicated wasn't through verbal communication, it was absences. Those were the only examples that you would see. That was the only thing that was talked about. It was the omission of what wasn't said, of what wasn't offered, of what wasn't. Nobody ever asked me if I had a girlfriend, or if, you know, it was just, you know, there's the kind of shaping through those expectations that are said and what is not said. And it took me a long time because I'm non-binary, and it took me into my 30s to realize that. And it was after having left this rural environment and having lived long and done a lot of research and realizing this isn't true. I've kind of shaped my whole being into this box that I was fitted in from birth. And it took a lot of unlearning and shedding to then realize this is not me. This doesn't feel right. This isn't congruent. This doesn't resonate. And it's very different experience living in my body now, having claimed my truth. And and I have a lot of emotion that maybe is audible in my voice. It's just what kind of still disturbs me when I think back is how hard it was to see, because it was the omission that was so powerful that made me realize there were other options. And I feel lucky that as I grew up and took more space, I needed the geographical space. I found different ways and found ways. I worked a lot on being myself, finding out who is this. And I don't know if I disagree or agree with different words, Nadia, but I love how you say you're not your body. And I feel like, yes, I am my body and so much else. I'm also a spirit. I just wanted to, I love it. I think we're saying the same thing, just using the opposite word. Anyway, so yeah, I just wanted to share that in gender. Thank you.
Thank you, Eva. Yeah, for bringing that forward. Really appreciate your vulnerability there. Naima, I'd love to hear from you.
Thank you. It's a bit dark here. I believe the previous question is very much related to this one, although the previous question will deserve hours and hours of discussion. But I'm surprised that we didn't reach the level of the systemic oppression between colonized and white supremacy, the objectivation of the body that is not white. And this is something as trauma survivors, when you look at the statistic, who are the people most impacted by trauma? So we cannot avoid the question of social justice when we talk about trauma recovery, because it's affecting a certain people, indigenous. Eva also mentioned the gender oppression that we need to take into consideration, but there's very much need to address the systemic traumatization of the society at different level in different ways. And it's increasing with, now we are objectifying ourselves with social media and this fabric of perfection and fake image that we need to hold no matter what. So this level of objectivation is reaching very worrying levels. And that's the reason why trauma and mental health issues are rising. And Eva mentioned something interesting as well when it comes to space. Yes, when a part of the recovery, when you are dealing with a toxic, dangerous, abusive person, is to remove yourself and go no contact. What do you do when this is the society all around you that is narcissistic? Where do you go? Or when you have no liberty of space, of traveling. My people in North Africa, they cannot travel in Europe whenever they want. There's this still oppression of the body throughout time, throughout space, that is not addressed. And I would love to see more of that in this conversation between us here.
Thank you, Naima. Yeah, it would be interesting to look at what are different embodied survival strategies given these different constraints, for example, space, what ends up happening there versus when you're working with someone who does have space, or embodied survival strategies when it comes to gender. Yeah, thank you for bringing that in. I think it is time for us to move on to our next question, but of course, let us tune in to our online audience. Aman said, I survived my trauma by focusing on my education and career, a form of escape reality. However, the trauma was still present in my subconscious, ready to explode with triggers. Mindfulness helped me. And I think Zoe, in response, shared a little reminder to stop and take a moment, reflect and respond instead of reacting. Thank you, Zoe. Okay, our next question is, go ahead and get to the screen share. Oops. Oops. There we go.
So yeah, before we jump into the other question, I wanted to honor the concept, the idea around looking at the larger systems that impact us, their invisibility, the invisibility of the impact. That's part of the illusion. That's part of the mystique of the system, and how important stories and narratives are critical to really understand the histories in order to be able to see beyond and to see the system and how it plays institutional in the larger systems of preferences and biases and all that. I appreciate that. It becomes something hard to often talk about because it's sometimes so well hidden, or there's different levels of privilege. And so with levels of privilege, sometimes privilege can, I think, somehow prevent recognition of the privilege, I think. So we can try to weave this in later, but I was just thinking about that. It made me think about it. But the question that we have before is, how do we perpetuate more harm by not understanding survival responses? This is fascinating because it kind of aligns. How do we perpetuate more harm by not understanding survival responses? Whew, I want to breathe on that one. So let's call it Renata.
Okay, so right off the jump. All right. So on the survival responses, we have those responses because of something that happened to us that should not have happened, or something that happened to us that did not happen to us that should have happened, and looking at complex trauma. So when we are not understanding, when we ignore, when we don't take into account any of those survival responses, we're in essence re-traumatizing that person and reinforcing the belief that they're not worth the dignity, that they're not worth the respect, that how everyone else has treated them, or the things that have happened to them is what that they deserved, and that's just the way it should be. And without that understanding, we can't come in and look at the individual or the systems and break it apart and go, what happened, why, and what changes need to be made to stop it.
Yeah, so I hear you. It's you're what I think you're saying is you're looking at the person as the issue and not the larger context and the conditions that might have contribute. And so in many ways, you can be putting more pressure or trauma, or you in fact trauma on the person versus looking at the system that created this person to respond in the way that they do.
Yeah, almost like the what did you call it? Compound barriers that you talk about. It's goes right along with that same vein.
That makes sense. Christine, bring us in here. Come on in, share your thoughts. Thank you.
Thank you. Well, on the personal level, my mind immediately goes to the phrase hurt people. And that's something that's constantly in my mind as I go through my own healing journey and help my own clients too, that this is all worth so much to treat ourselves better and then be able to treat other people better on a personal level. But even systemically in society, if we don't call out those survival strategies and where they're not measuring up for us to transform the kind of world that we live in, they're just going to perpetuate. So we have to first have awareness with anything, right? You have to have awareness and then have some real solid strategies that work to transform that. Otherwise, it perpetuates.
Yes, that's true. How critical. So it's so funny. The chat also talks about this, the absence of the awareness or forgetting or the like that. Without the awareness, when something becomes invisible or intentional invisibility, it allows the system or the process to continue to dehumanize and to harm because people don't see the harm or they don't really connect the harming intersections. I hear what you're saying. I think that's what yes. Thank you. Danny, come on in here, buddy. I'm not buddy, but come on in here. Bring your voice to the table as well.
So appeasement was the stress response that I personally identified with the most. And a passage that I had underlined was after the description of the domestic workers organizing and needing to learn both how appeasement was a really brilliant social strategy, survival strategy, and then at the same time also an over-reliance on appeasement was a barrier to achieving the organizing goals that they were trying to bring about. And so the author had written, as women, as immigrants, and Black, Latina, Filipina women, as poor people, what would a strong, dignified, or defiant stance have produced? Likely more violence. Appeasement becomes required by the social conditions. And then so she had, similar descriptions of the social conditions that either would bring about certain survival responses in people and would disinhibit other ones in people. So then, kind of like counterbalancing examples here, she's in the fight response, she's talking about over-policed, over-surveilled Black Americans, men in particular, not being safe to express vulnerability and having to really harden against the world, and then being, over-policed, over-surveilled, incarcerated, so on and so forth. And then on the flip side of this, we have the domestic workers having challenges with organizing as a result of being socialized in such a way to be very appeasement-based that doesn't allow for advocating and trying to change exploitative working conditions and so on and so forth. So those were kind of two sides of the same coin, I thought, from a couple of different stress responses and social conditions surrounding those.
And what I think is so fascinating, it talks about the complexity of navigating worlds of privilege versus oppression, and that there's not a one size fits all, and that is so nuanced, and just the sophistication in terms of being able, some people call it code switching, or being able to adapt and to adjust, and how that is such a high skill, but it's also an oppressive experience to have to gauge. How do you protect? Do you appease? How do you how do you, what they call it, torch yourself? How do you twist and change oneself to just survive? That is the most fascinating part. It's not to thrive, but in some situations, just to survive. How do you navigate this structural process that's not designed for you to be authentic in wholeness, but to be adjusting in order to survive? I don't know if that's just my own idea, but I'm curious of others. I know I'm taking up Teresa. I don't know how can I have one more minute? But I don't know. What do you think?
Yeah, let's take one more.
Naima.
Yes. I want to join you in this idea. However, you distinguish privilege and oppression. I see oppression, but using a twisted way. The soft way, distraction, glorifying each other, and the hard way, punishment. And that's something that it comes from Foucault in Crime and Punishment, or Discipline and Punishment, and his concept of prison, that creating prison actually create violence. And he call it the, I can't remember, the panopticism. And the panopticism is actually the architecture of our prison, where the tower is at the center. And so one guard can actually observe many prisoners at the same time. But this is actually the society we created. So the hard way to oppress is to put people in physical prisons. And the soft way to oppress them is to create this invisible prison, which is trauma when you think about it. So you choose your pill, but I don't see privilege. I see just difficulties that together we can address. I went to a lecture, just 1 second. I went to a lecture in Oxford. I live in Oxford. Something is very disturbing. It was a lecture run by academics, scholars, and they are starting a movement on anti-decolonization. And the room, the theater, 500 people were applauding them. And they got funding, and they're saying that the colonization did not happen the way people are saying, that England actually campaigned for anti-slavery. I mean, when you see scholars saying that, it is disturbing, very, very disturbing. But something that is shocking to me as well is when I shared that, I was quite overwhelmed after this lecture, and I shared that with people, and they look at me and they say, I'm so sorry about how you feel. But they didn't relate to that.
Yeah.
It is not a problem that I am facing because I'm indigenous. It is a problem that all of us need to address.
Right.
So we are still in those separation, division between people, and it's based on race. It's based on so many different aspects that the body, the somatic, can help us to address and reconnect.
Well, thank you so much. And I think that is very fascinating. The idea is it's not that there the complexity of invisibility of oppression can that it can impact all. And that's a collective inclusive narrative. Like it impacts all is harmed. Um, there might be levels of harm, but the idea that there is a collective impact that is concerning. I think that's a great way to frame that, because it allows everyone then to say, I have to put my hand in the pot to try to do something, because this is a collective harm. Yeah. Teresa, I'm turning it back over to you. Thank you. This has been good, guys. I don't know about you, everyone. Sorry, I'm using all the. It's getting late here, so all my language is changing. So this has been great, everyone. This has been great.
Yeah, so we'll wrap up. This will be our final question. You can just ignore where it says question 4. I've just been playing around with the order as the conversation has guided us. But can healing happen on a widespread level while living under a power over system? So can healing happen on a widespread level while living under a power over system? Karen's hand is first to go up. Karen.
Okay. So I think this question is complex. So I want to say yes, but it's maybe the healing might be limited unless the people within that system are at least aware that there is power over them. If there's an awareness and work and education around that, if people take chances to be vulnerable. But I think the primary thing is learning how to trust oneself. So if people in this collective system decide to trust themselves, you know, what they're feeling, what they're thinking, what their bodies are experiencing, what their understanding of their spirituality, if they're using all these sensations and symptoms and thoughts and feelings and are working to have authentic relationships with the other people around them, yeah, I do think healing can happen. I mean, because most of us are living in oppressed systems, probably all of us. And again, it's to what degree, right? We're more privileged in the US if you're Caucasian, you know, than some other disenfranchised places or people of color living in US can argue that they don't have privilege here. So, you know, it's a perhaps is the answer. Yes, if people are aware and working on getting educated and learning to trust themselves first, I think it is possible, but limited while these oppressive systems are in place.
Yeah. Thank you for going first and speaking into the complexity of it. Susan.
Thanks. I don't know if I can point to a passage in Staci Haines right off the top of my head. Yesterday, I was teaching something by the Métis scholar Michelle Murphy, and they say you can't go the minute you go to kind of the blank slate, like we have to, you know, topple capitalism, colonialism has to be completely dismantled, anything like that. You're going back to the logic of terra nullius, which is not a good place to start, you know, which is where the colonization of the Americas started. It's not, we're in this system and we have to start kind of working against it from within it. And so I think that all of the strategies that we're getting in this book, one of the things I think it's doing very effectively is teaching people who are in social and environmental movement not to replicate the logic of the systems they're trying to bring down. And so, like an example, Adrienne Marie Brown who did her training with Staci Haines will say, you know, wrote a book called We Will Not Cancel Us. And she says, if you really believe in prison abolition and police abolition, you can't then create an alternative society where certain people aren't allowed to participate and they're kept in the margins in a separate space. Like, we have to build the kind of society that that doesn't have that structure as its basis. And so I think what all this work is trying to do is to kind of dismantle all of these things internally, to open up the possibilities for creating something alternative, while the other, the other systems of the power over systems are ongoing, and the power with are being built at the same time, and will actually look so much more desirable than power over in the end, that nobody will want to be, very few people will want to participate in a power over. But I think that that's a really key message of the book to me, is work on this now, work on this internally, and then the external work follows from it. So yeah.
Yes. Yeah. Thank you. Eva?
Well, it makes me, the image I have in response to that question is, it's like a sinking ship and then bailing water out. Can you save the ship without actually trying to fix the leak in the bottom of the boat? And I think the whole term power over clearly suggests that while we're in a power over system, there's someone on the bottom there. How are they going to feel healed and have the same access to freedom and privileges? So I think ultimately it needs complete systems change for true healing to occur, which isn't to mean that there isn't a lot we can do within, but I think it would be outrageous to settle for that and think it's good enough. I mean, that feels more like a kind of, if I'm okay, then that's fine, but that's not the world I want to live in. And I think of Resmaa Menakem and his amazing book My Grandmother's Hands, who talks also so powerfully about white body trauma and the disconnect that like to actually the deadening and numbing that I have to carry in my body to kind of feel fine. It's how fine am I really? It's not really true. That's not to say that I can't, there's a lot of privileges I have. I don't mean to say that's nothing, that's a lot, but to really be alive, I think it's a different system. But yeah, whether we can get there, that's another discussion.
Yeah. Hearing a lot of all of us pointing along the same thing of what does this question ask when it's happen on a widespread level? And I think at the end of the day, we all have hope, because if we didn't have hope, then we probably wouldn't be here having this conversation. And so we have to have hope on some level that, of course, doing our own work in the way that we show up individually, and our work as communities and societies, that is our agency. And that agency is very important even to our own healing. And as we try and reflect agency and bring other people into agency, that it is doing something. And at the same time, it is going to require widespread systems change. So let's take one more. Renata, if you could close this out, please. You just have to unmute.
Like that's where we're all at in life now. So it caused me to think of two quotes. One by Margaret Mead: "Never doubt that as a group of thoughtful, committed citizens can change the world. Indeed, it is the only thing that ever has." And then also in the book, Staci says, we need to change ourselves to change society, and we need to change the structure of society to change ourselves at scale. And so it's like what we're doing now, this discussion, any kind of discussion we have that we can bring like-minded individuals, and then bring in individuals that are not like-minded and have those discussions, is how the systems change, while we are creating a safe place for ourselves to be able to work on what needs to change in our stuff somatically, so we can then continue to affect and make the change that needs to happen to kind of, I don't want to say overthrow, but the power over society.
Yeah, thank you for bringing both those quotes in. That feels very on point, and it's great to be reminded of the wisdom that Staci has shared with us in this beautiful book. Which it's been wonderful to spend this time in discussion with you all, going through some vulnerabilities, personal reflections, talking about the individual level and up to the systemic level. So thank you all so much. Frederick, would you like to share a closing reflection?
No, I just want to say this was such a great conversation to bring people together, to come into each other's homes or workspaces and just explore this together. I do believe, similar to what you just said, that it does take a group of people who are committed not just on an interpersonal level, but beginning to think about what are the systems that are at play? What are the things that are invisible? And what are the harm that's being impacted? Maybe not on me, but on others. I think that becomes the awareness that we all need, everyone, because it impacts us collectively overall. So thank you. This has been such a great night and looking forward to our next conversation.
Yeah. Thank you all. Thank you to the panelists for showing up and being here with us today. They've joined us from all around the world, from South Carolina to Toronto to Southern California, Oklahoma, and UK. Thank you to everyone who's been following along in YouTube and sharing your questions. It really feels wonderful to have a community here and participating with us from all over. Again, feel free to, if you followed along and you want to come on and be a part of the conversation, please feel free to visit the website and apply as a panelist. And yeah, get to know us. You know, something that's wonderful about the Trauma Research Foundation is this opportunity to come and participate as communities so that we can have the conversation together. And I'll say that that's actually going to be the theme of our next conference coming up, which is going to be the later part of January, which is all about big conversations around race and systemic trauma. And a lot of the focus of that is going to be about how do we be in conversation with one another in or around difficult topics where we may have different and differing opinions based upon our own experiences and our own beliefs, but how can we stay together, be at the table and be with one another, as opposed to you know, what we see in a lot of the world, which is a lot of the division. So thank you all for being a part of this conversation. We'll be back again, same time, same place next week.